"You built this on our land." That's what the woman in the tailored suit said when she stepped onto my porch. Not a question. A declaration. Like the deed in my drawer meant nothing. Like I hadn't spent 7 years splitting logs and stacking stone until my hands bled building the only promise I had left to keep. I'm Beckett Thorne, 46, former wilderness guide. When my wife died, we'd already picked this spot, remote, quiet, no one around to tell us how to live. I bought the land, checked every document. No one ever mentioned a homeowners association. There wasn't one, until now. Drop a comment below if you're watching from the app or the browser. I want to know who's following this story. And hit like, subscribe if you'd like to help the channel grow. That little thanks button down below means a lot. The morning light hit the lodge the way it always did, gold through the pines, slanting across the balcony where I stood with my coffee. Steam rose from the mug, mingling with the cold mountain air. Below, the valley stretched out in layers of green and shadow, untouched exactly as Claire and I had imagined it. This was the view we'd sketched on a napkin at a diner 8 years ago, back when she was still here. Back when the future felt like something we could build together. Now it was just me and the house, and most days that was enough. I ran my hand along the railing, Douglas fir hand-planed. I'd cut it myself from a tree that had fallen during a winter storm in year 3. Every board in this place had a story like that, where it came from, how I shaped it, why it mattered. The stone fireplace inside came from a creek bed 2 miles west. The support beams were salvaged from an old logging road. I didn't hire a crew. I didn't want one. This wasn't just construction. It was a conversation between me and the land, and I'd spent 7 years learning its language. Year 1, I cleared the site and poured the foundation, living in a tent through frost and wind. By year 3, the frame stood 2 stories steep roof, for snow windows open to the light. I fixed mistakes as I went, learning the house the way you learn a language. By year 6, the wiring, plumbing, and walls were done. Every piece carried a story. The final year, I planted the garden, leveled the drive, and hung the last door, finishing what Claire and I had begun. When it was done, I stood on this balcony and felt something I hadn't felt since she died. Not happiness exactly, more like peace, like I'd kept my word. The land had cost $43,000. I bought it from an older man named Gerald Finch, a retired farmer who had owned it for decades and never built on it. The sale was straightforward. Deed transferred at the county office, title insurance in place, survey map showing clear boundaries. The property was mine, free and clear, sitting outside any municipal limits or planned developments. That's why I chose it. But about a month ago, Boone Latimer, a carpenter in his 70s who had helped me with some of the framing, stopped by with a cooler of beer and a strange look on his face. We sat on the porch and he said he'd heard talk in town. Something about a homeowners association forming up in the hills. I laughed it off. Told him this land had been independent for as long as anyone could remember. He shrugged, drank his beer, and said he hoped I was right. I thought that was the end of it. Then 2 weeks ago, a black SUV appeared. It rolled up the dirt driveway mid-afternoon, too clean for the terrain, windows tinted dark. I was outside splitting firewood, and I stopped when I saw it. No one came up here unless they had a reason. The doors opened, and 2 men stepped out, both in suits, both carrying clipboards, both moving with the kind of confidence that comes from having paperwork on your side. They didn't wave, didn't smile, just walked straight toward me like they'd been here before. The taller one spoke first. "Excuse me, are you Beckett Thorne?" I set the axe down and said I was. "We need to talk about your property," he continued, and the way he said it, not a question, not a request, made my jaw tighten. I wiped my hands on my jeans and waited. The shorter man pulled a business card from his pocket and held it out. I took it. Glossy cardstock, raised lettering. Margot Winslow, President, Cascade Heights Homeowners Association. Below that, a phone number and an address in town. The taller man flipped open his clipboard, showing me a map I'd never seen before. "We represent the HOA for this area. According to our records, your property falls within the boundaries established in 2018. You should have received notification at the time of formation. I stared at the map. The lines didn't match my survey, not even close. "This is wrong," I said. "I bought this land outright. There was no HOA. There's never been one." The shorter man cleared his throat. "Mr. Thorne, I understand this is unexpected, but the association has legal standing. We'll be sending formal documentation within the week. If you have questions, Ms. Winslow is happy to discuss them." They didn't wait for me to respond, just turned and walked back to the SUV, gravel crunching under their shoes. I stood there holding the card, watching them drive away. The valley was quiet again. The axe lay in the dirt where I'd dropped it. And for the first time since I'd finished the lodge, the peace I'd felt started to crack. That night, I sat inside by the fire, the business card on the table in front of me. The lodge was dark, except for the orange glow from the hearth. Shadows moved across the walls I'd built, walls that were supposed to be mine. I picked up the card and turned it over. Nothing on the back, just smooth, expensive paper. 7 years. I'd verified every transaction walked, every boundary line made, certain no one could come back later and say I'd missed something. But something was wrong. I could feel it, the way you feel a storm coming before the first drop of rain. The air was different, the weight of it, and I couldn't shake the image of that map, the lines that didn't match the boundaries that didn't make sense. I looked at the photo on the mantle. Claire in her hiking boots standing on a ridge with the sun behind her, smiling like she'd just won an argument. We'd talked about this place for years. No neighbors, no rules, just us and the mountains. "I kept the promise," I said to the empty room, but outside the wind picked up, rattling the pines, and somewhere far below, headlights swept across the valley road. Still, something in the air had shifted, and I was only just beginning to understand what. The letter arrived 1 week later, exactly as promised. I found it wedged in the mailbox at the end of the driveway, a thick envelope with a return address I didn't recognize. No stamps, hand-delivered. I tore it open, standing there in the cold breath, fogging in front of me, and the first line made my chest tighten. "Official notice of property claim in HOA jurisdiction." The words were printed in bold at the top of the page, formal and detached, like they were discussing someone else's life. But they weren't. They were discussing mine. The letter stated that my property, the lodge I'd built, the land I'd bought, fell within the boundaries of the Cascade Heights Homeowners Association, established in 2018. It demanded payment of retroactive membership fees totaling $45,000, covering 5 years of unpaid dues. Below that, a list of violations. The roof pitch was too steep. The exterior stain was unapproved. The landscaping didn't conform to community standards. And at the bottom, a final paragraph that felt like a fist to the gut. If I failed to comply within 30 days, the HOA reserved the right to reclaim the property for community use. I read it 3 times. Each time the words felt less real and more like a threat someone had written as a joke, except no one was laughing. Back at the lodge, I laid the HOA letter beside my deed and surveyed the morning light sharp through the windows. The papers all told the same story. Clear title, clean boundaries, no sign of any association. I checked again, slower this time. Nothing changed. Everything still said the land was mine. I called the title company first. The woman on the phone sounded friendly until I explained the situation, and then her tone shifted. "Let me pull your file," she said, and I heard typing in the background. A long pause. "Mr. Thorne, our records show we issued a clear title policy. If there's a claim against the property now that's unusual, we'll need to investigate." I asked how long that would take. Could be a few weeks, maybe longer. I thanked her and hung up. Then I tried calling Gerald Finch, the man I had bought the land from. The number I had for him rang 4 times and went to a generic voicemail. I left a message asking him to call me back. He never did. By the time I finished making calls, it was past noon, and I still didn't have answers, just more questions. So I got in the truck and drove into town. The HOA office was on Main Street, tucked between an insurance agency and a coffee shop, with clean glass windows and a sign that looked like it had been installed recently. I parked across the street and sat there for a minute staring at the building. Part of me wanted to turn around, but the other part, the part that had spent 7 years making sure every detail was right, needed to know what the hell was happening. Inside the office was all polished wood and soft lighting, the kind of place designed to make you feel like everything was under control. A receptionist sat behind a curved desk, and when I gave my name, she nodded like she'd been expecting me. "Ms. Winslow will see you now," she said, gesturing toward a hallway. I followed it to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the street, and there she was, Margot Winslow, mid-50s, sharp suit hair pulled back tight. She stood when I entered, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, professional, cold. "Mr. Thorne," she said, motioning to a chair, "I understand this is uncomfortable, but the law is clear." I sat down and pulled the letter from my jacket. "Show me the proof," I said. "Show me the map that includes my land." She didn't hesitate. She opened a folder on her desk and slid a document across to me. It was a map, but not the one I'd seen before. This one had more detail with shaded zones and labeled boundaries. My property was circled in red. "Historical records," she said. "Your seller, Mr. Finch, wasn't fully aware of the boundaries when he sold to you. It happens more often than you'd think." I stared at the map. The lines still didn't match mine. "That's impossible," I said. "I did my due diligence. I have a survey. I have a deed. There was no HOA. She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. "Sometimes mistakes happen, Mr. Thorne. The county records weren't updated properly, but we have documentation going back decades. This land has always been part of the association's jurisdiction." I felt my pulse in my temples. Then why am I only hearing about this now? Why didn't anyone tell me when I bought the land? She gave me a thin smile. "We're telling you now, and we're willing to be flexible. Join the association, pay the fees, you can keep your lodge." She slid another paper across the desk. "With some modifications, of course." I looked at the list. "Change the roof color to neutral gray. Lower the roof line by 2 feet to meet height restrictions. Remove all non-approved landscaping and replace it with species from the approved plant list. Repaint the exterior in one of 3 designated shades." My stomach turned. Every single change would gut the design Claire and I had planned. The steep roof was for snow load. The stain was chosen to blend with the forest. The plants were native, chosen because they belonged here. "This isn't about compliance," I said quietly. "This is about erasing what I built." Margot's expression didn't change. "It's about community standards, Mr. Thorne. Everyone has to follow the same rules." I stood up the chair, scraping against the floor. "I'll review this with a lawyer." She nodded like she'd expected that. "Of course, but I'd encourage you not to wait too long. The 30-day window starts from the date of the letter." I walked out without another word, the papers clenched in my fist. The drive back up the mountain felt longer than usual. The trees blurred past and my hands were tight on the wheel. When I got home, I sat in the truck for a while, engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the lodge through the windshield. It looked the same as it always had, solid, permanent, mine, but now there was a shadow over it, something I couldn't see but could feel pressing down. That night I sat by the fire again, the HOA documents spread across the coffee table, the list of modifications, the map that didn't match. The letter threatened to take it all away. I looked at Claire's photo on the mantel, the firelight catching her smile. "They want to erase it," I said under my breath. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass, the old beams answering with a low groan. I turned back to the laptop. If they wanted a fight, I was ready to learn their game. The first notice came on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after my meeting with the HOA president. County Building Department, official letterhead. The envelope was thin, but the words inside were heavy. Notice of permit deficiency, final occupancy certificate required. I read it twice, standing in the kitchen with my coffee going cold. According to the letter, my lodge lacked a final occupancy permit, and until the deficiency was corrected, the structure was subject to a stop-use order. I walked to the filing cabinet and pulled out my permits. Building permit approved, electrical inspection passed, plumbing inspection passed, final occupancy certificate signed by a county inspector named Richard Moss, dated November of last year. I had the original stamped and notarized. I called the number on the letter. A woman answered her voice, flat and administrative. I explained the situation and offered to fax over my certificate. She put me on hold. When she came back, her tone hadn't changed. Our records show no final inspection was completed for your property. The inspector listed on your certificate is no longer with the department. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I'm holding the signed document right now, I said. It's official, it's stamped. She paused. I'll need to verify that with my supervisor. In the meantime, consider this a stop-use order. Do not occupy the structure until we complete a re-inspection. I asked when that would be. We're scheduling 6 to 8 weeks out. She hung up before I could argue. I drove down the mountain that afternoon and found a bright red placard stapled to my front door. Occupancy prohibited pending inspection. The letters were bold, impossible to miss, designed to shame. I tore it down and crumpled it in my fist, but the damage was done. Anyone driving by would have seen it. The lodge I'd spent 7 years building was now officially labeled as non-compliant, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it, except wait. 2 days later, the second notice arrived. County Tax Assessor. This one was thicker with charts and tables breaking down a new property valuation. My taxes had been increased by 340%. The reason listed was a reclassification from agricultural to commercial resort. I stared at the number. $78,000, due in 60 days. I'd never run a business on the property, never rented it out. It was my home. I called the tax office and got transferred 3 times before reaching someone who claimed to understand the issue. It's in the system, the man said. Reclassified based on updated land use data. I asked where that data came from. I don't have access to that information. You can file an appeal, but you'll need to pay the assessed amount first. Refunds take 6 to 12 months. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table staring at the 2 notices side by side. Stop use order, tax reclassification, both within the same week, both targeting the same property. It wasn't a coincidence. It was coordination, and it was just getting started. The third notice came by certified mail. Zoning board hearing. I was being summoned to a public hearing to address alleged violations of setback requirements. According to the zoning board, my lodge was built too close to the property line, violating county code by 15 feet. I pulled out my survey again and measured the distances myself. The lodge sat 75 feet from the nearest boundary. The code required 50. I was well within compliance, but the hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out, and if I didn't attend, the board could issue fines or demand structural changes. I marked the date on my calendar and started preparing my defense. The hearing was held in a conference room at the county building, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, 5 board members sitting behind a long table. I brought my survey, my permits, and photographs showing the distances. The chairman, a man in his 60s with reading glasses and a bored expression, called the meeting to order. Mr. Thorne, you're here regarding alleged setback violations at your property. The board has received a complaint and updated survey data suggesting non-compliance. I stood and presented my original survey pointing out the measurements. This is the official survey completed at the time of purchase. It shows clear compliance with all setback requirements. The chairman glanced at it, then nodded to someone at the side of the room. A lawyer I recognized from the HOA stood and approached with a folder. Mr. Chairman, we'd like to present updated survey data reflecting corrected property boundaries. He handed out copies of a new map. I looked at mine and felt my jaw tighten. The property line had been moved. On this version, it cut 20 feet deeper into my land, putting the lodge within the setback zone. This is wrong, I said louder than I intended. This isn't my property line. I have the original survey right here. The chairman held up a hand. Mr. Thorne will take both documents under advisement. This board will issue a decision within 30 days. 3 of the board members hadn't made eye contact with me once. They shuffled papers, nodded along, and when the chairman called for adjournment, they stood and filed out like it was just another Tuesday. The lawyer from the HOA gave me a brief professional nod on his way past. I stayed in my seat staring at the fake map until the room was empty. That night, I spread everything out on the floor of the lodge. Building notice, tax letter, zoning summons. 3 separate agencies, 3 separate attacks, all within 3 weeks. I grabbed a notebook and started making a timeline, writing down every date, every notice, every phone call. Patterns emerged. Each letter referenced updated records or new information, but none of them explained where that information came from. None of them provided documentation I could verify. It was a system designed to bury me in paperwork, to force compliance through exhaustion. I sat back against the couch and looked around the room. The walls I'd built, the floor I'd laid, the windows I'd installed, all of it suddenly felt fragile, like it could be taken apart with the stroke of a pen. I thought about calling someone, a lawyer maybe, or a friend, but it was past midnight and I didn't even know where to start. The fire had burned down to embers and the lodge was dark, except for the glow of my laptop screen. I opened a search engine and typed in property rights attorneys in Washington. A dozen names came up. I clicked through a few websites scanning bios and case results, but my eyes kept drifting back to the timeline on the floor. I looked at the photo of Claire on the mantle. Maybe they're right, I said quietly. Maybe I'm just one guy who thought he could escape the system. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it, because the system wasn't supposed to work this way. It wasn't supposed to coordinate attacks on someone who'd followed every rule. And if I gave up now, if I walked away, then 7 years meant nothing. The promise meant nothing. I closed the laptop and picked up the notebook again. If this was a coordinated campaign, then there had to be a source. Someone pulling the strings. Someone who wanted this land badly enough to weaponize 3 county departments at once. I started writing names. The HOA president, the zoning board chairman, the tax assessor. I didn't have proof yet, but I was going to find it. The posts started appearing online 3 days after the zoning hearing. I didn't see them at first. I wasn't the type to spend much time on social media, but a neighbor I barely knew sent me a screenshot with a short message. Thought you should see this. The post was in a local community group, shared by someone I'd never met. That guy up on Ridge Road refuses to follow community rules, built without proper permits. Now he's fighting the HOA and dragging property values down for everyone. Underneath a thread of comments, people I didn't know piling on. Selfish. Entitled. Thinks he's above the law. I scrolled through my chest, tightening with each line. Half the information was wrong. The other half was twisted just enough to make me look like the problem. I tried to respond. Logged into the group, typed out a calm explanation. I had permits. I had a deed. The HOA's claim was based on falsified boundaries. I hit the post and waited. Within 10 minutes, my comment was gone. Deleted. I tried again. Same result. Then a notification popped up. You have been removed from this group. I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking in the empty text box. They'd silenced me before I could even defend myself. And the posts kept coming. More screenshots arrived over the next 2 days, each one worse than the last. Someone claimed I'd threatened county workers. Another said I was running an illegal commercial operation. None of it was true, but truth didn't seem to matter. The narrative had already been written, and I wasn't allowed to edit it. I started noticing the shift when I went into town. At the grocery store, a woman I'd seen a dozen times before looked right through me, turning her cart down another aisle before I could say hello. At the hardware store, the clerk who usually joked about my lumber orders rang me up in silence, barely making eye contact. And then there was the encounter with the older woman who lived a few miles down the valley. I'd met her once at a community potluck back when I first started building. She'd brought a casserole and told me the lodge was going to be beautiful. Now, standing in the parking lot outside the post office, she stopped me with a hand on my arm. "I heard you're causing trouble for the community," she said, her voice tight. I started to explain, but she cut me off. "I don't want to hear excuses. People like you think you can do whatever you want. Well, you can't." She walked away before I could respond, and I stood there with a package in my hand, feeling like I'd been punched. That evening, Boone showed up at the lodge with pizza and a six-pack. He didn't say much at first, just handed me a beer and sat down on the porch steps. We ate in silence for a while, the sun dropping behind the ridge, the valley turning purple in the fading light. Finally, he spoke. "I know what they're doing. I've seen this before." I looked at him, and he met my eyes. 20 years ago, the HOA tried to claim old Miller's ranch. Same tactics, same legal pressure. Miller fought for a while, but he was in his 70s and it wore him down. Sold the place for pennies just to get out from under it. I asked why no one had stopped them. Boone shrugged. "People are scared. The woman running the HOA now, she's got connections. Mayor's office, county commissioners. She used to be a prosecutor, so she knows how to intimidate people. And most folks would rather keep their heads down than get involved." He reached into his truck and pulled out a dusty cardboard box, setting it on the porch between us. "But there's something off about their maps. Back in the 90s, I worked on survey crews, just labor, but I remember the boundaries up here. They don't match what the HOA is claiming." He opened the box and pulled out rolled papers, spreading them on the porch. Old survey maps yellowed with age, marked with pencil notes and faded ink. "This is from 95. See this line? That's the old logging boundary. Your land is outside it, way outside." I studied the map, comparing it mentally to the one the HOA had shown. The discrepancy was obvious. "Why would they fake this?" I asked. Boone looked at me like the answer was obvious. "Because your land is worth a hell of a lot more than you paid for it. Prime location. If they can take it, they can develop it, or sell it. Either way, someone makes a fortune." The next morning, a sheriff's deputy knocked on my door. I opened it to find a young guy, maybe late 20s, holding a clipboard and looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Thorne, I need to serve you with this." He handed me a thick envelope. I opened it right there, the deputy watching. "Order of possession." The words jumped off the page. The HOA had won a default judgment against me in court. I hadn't even known there was a hearing. According to the paperwork, I'd failed to appear, and the court had ruled in their favor. I had 14 days to vacate the property. "This can't be legal," I said, my voice barely steady. "I was never notified of any hearing." The deputy shifted his weight. "Sir, I'm just serving the papers. You need to talk to a lawyer, fast." And he handed me a second document, a copy of the court's mailing records. It showed a certified letter sent to my address 3 weeks ago, notifying me of the hearing date. But I'd never received it. I checked my mailbox every day. There was no record of any attempt to deliver. I asked the deputy if he remembered seeing a process server up here. He shook his head. "I don't know anything about that, sir. I'm just doing my job." He left, and I stood in the doorway holding the eviction notice, the words blurring as I read them again. Default judgment. Failure to appear. Order of possession. The HOA claimed I was a squatter on their land. They'd submitted evidence, a historical deed from 1952 and an updated survey from 2020. The court had accepted it. And because I hadn't been there to challenge it, I'd lost by default. I spent the next 36 hours at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and my laptop running on coffee and adrenaline. I pulled up every property law statute I could find, read through HOA regulations, surveying standards, and Washington State civil procedure codes. I learned that the state required actual notice for property disputes, not just mailing a letter, but proof that the notice was actually received. I had no such proof in the court record. No signature, no delivery confirmation, just a claim that a letter had been sent. I started building a timeline documenting every piece of mail I'd received over the past 2 months. I took photos of my mailbox showing no signs of damage or tampering. I pulled up my credit card statements to prove I'd been home during the alleged delivery window. Then I created a spreadsheet cross-referencing every notice I'd received with the dates the HOA claimed to have sent correspondence. The gaps were obvious. They'd deliberately kept me in the dark, letting the court date pass so they could win without opposition. By the time the sun came up on the second day, I had a 40-page document laying out the timeline, the inconsistencies, and the legal grounds for challenging the default judgment. My hands were shaking from exhaustion and too much caffeine, but I had something solid, something I could use. I just needed help. I searched for property rights attorneys in Washington and found a name that kept appearing in articles and case summaries, a lawyer who specialized in fighting wrongful HOA actions. Her website was simple, but her track record was impressive. I drafted an email, attached my 40-page document, and hit send at 2 a.m. The subject line read, "I need help. They're trying to steal my home." I leaned back in my chair and looked around the lodge. The fire had gone out hours ago, and the room was cold. Through the window I could see the first hints of dawn touching the ridge. 14 days. That's all I had. 14 days to find a way to stop this, or everything I'd built would be gone. I picked up the photo of Claire from the mantel and held it in both hands. "I'm not giving up," I said to the empty room. "Not yet." Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and somewhere far off a hawk called. The valley was waking up, indifferent to my fight, but I wasn't indifferent, not anymore. I closed the laptop and stood, every muscle in my body aching. If they wanted this land, they were going to have to prove they had the right to take it, and I was going to make damn sure the proof held up. The lawyer arrived at 8 a.m, driving a dusty sedan up the gravel driveway like she'd done it 100 times before. I watched from the porch as she stepped out, 30s, dressed in a blazer and jeans, hiking boots caked with mud. She walked up with a messenger bag slung over one shoulder and extended a hand. "Mr. Thorne, I'm here to help. I read your file twice. This is one of the most blatant cases I've seen." We sat at the kitchen table, and she spread out my documents alongside her own notes. She worked methodically, flipping through pages, cross-referencing dates, highlighting sections with a yellow marker. After 20 minutes, she looked up. "The default judgment is wrong. We can file a motion to vacate based on improper service. They have to prove you were notified, and from what I see here, they can't." I asked how we'd prove I wasn't notified. She tapped the court records. "The burden of proof is on them. They need a signed return receipt or a process server's affidavit. There's neither. Just a certificate of mailing with no tracking, no signature, nothing. That's not sufficient for a property seizure." Then she pointed to something I'd missed. "And look at this. The HOA's historical deed is dated 1952, but Cascade Heights HOA wasn't incorporated until 2018. They're claiming ownership based on a document that predates their existence by 66 years. That's not just suspicious, it's impossible." An hour later, Boone showed up with his box of old maps. The three of us stood around the table, unrolling papers that smelled like dust and decades. Boone pointed to a survey from '95, tracing the boundary lines with a calloused finger. "This is the official boundary from back when I worked the cruise. Your land is outside any HOA zone, way outside." When the lawyer unrolled the HOA's newer map beside Boone's, the change was undeniable, 200 feet erased with a single stroke. My land redrawn into theirs. She picked up her phone and dialed. "State Surveyor Board, I need to verify my license." She gave them the name from the HOA survey. A pause. Then her expression hardened. "And what's his current status?" Another pause. "Suspended in 2019. Got it. Thank you." She hung up and looked at me. "The surveyor who certified the HOA map doesn't have a valid license. Hasn't had one for 6 years. That survey is worthless." She made another call, this time to a contact who specialized in digital forensics. 2 days later, we had the results. The HOA's survey file had been created in 2020, but the metadata showed it had been modified in 2024, just weeks before they first contacted me. Someone had opened the file in editing software and manually redrawn the property lines. The changes didn't match the county's GIS database. They didn't match any historical record. They were fabricated. The lawyer printed the forensic report and added it to the growing stack of evidence. "This is fraud," she said quietly, "and we can prove it." But the biggest revelation came when she filed a preliminary motion for an injunction. The motion required the HOA to disclose financial records, and what came back was damning. The HOA had received a $500,000 development loan from a company called Cascade Resort Group. When the lawyer dug deeper, she found the connection. The HOA president was a silent partner in the resort company. She'd personally signed the loan agreement. And buried in an email chain leaked by a disgruntled secretary who'd been pressured into falsifying meeting minutes was a list titled Priority Acquisition Targets. My property was at the top with a handwritten note in the margin. Prime resort location, estimated value $2.5 million. The lawyer set the email printout in front of me. This isn't about HOA governance. It's about real estate fraud. She wants your land to develop a resort. The loan, the fake surveys, the legal pressure, it's all designed to force you out so she can take it. I stared at the note, the casual way my home had been reduced to a dollar figure and a development opportunity. "What do we do now?" I asked. She closed her folder and leaned back. "We filed a comprehensive counterclaim. Fraud, slander of title, violation of property rights, and we go public. The court will take weeks, but public pressure can move faster." That afternoon, she arranged for me to meet with a reporter who specialized in local corruption wusses. The reporter arrived with a camera and a notebook, and we sat on the porch while I told the story from the beginning. She recorded everything, took photos of the lodge, reviewed the documents. 2 days later, the article went live in the regional paper. HOA land grab, how Cascade Heights uses fake maps to steal property. The response was immediate. The story got picked up by a larger outlet. Comments flooded in. A local representative tweeted about investigating the case. Within 48 hours, a petition had circulated, calling for the HOA president's recall. Anonymous tips started arriving at the lawyer's office. Other properties, other victims, other schemes. That night, the three of us sat in the lodge, the lawyer Boone and me. The table was covered in files, but for the first time in weeks, the weight on my chest had lifted slightly. "We have enough to file," the lawyer said. "Motion to vacate the judgment, emergency injunction to stop the eviction, and a counterclaim that's going to put her on the defensive." I asked how long it would take. The judge accepted an emergency hearing in 10 days. "It's fast, but we'll be ready." Boone raised his beer. "You're doing what Miller couldn't. You're standing." I nodded, but I didn't feel victorious yet. The fight was just beginning. The lawyer filed the motion package on a Friday morning. 218 pages. Motion to vacate default judgment. Emergency injunction to halt eviction. Counterclaim for fraud. Slander of title and violation of property rights. Every claim was backed by exhibits, the fake survey analysis, the suspended surveyor's license records, the financial documents showing the HOA president's conflict of interest, the leaked emails with my property listed as a development target. She'd cited statutes and case law with surgical precision, building an argument that was airtight and impossible to ignore. The court clerk stamped the filing, and within hours the opposing counsel received their copies. The emergency hearing was set for 10 days out. While the legal machinery ground forward, the public campaign gained momentum. The reporter I'd spoken with didn't stop at one article. She dug deeper, tracking down others who'd been targeted by the same HOA. An older man who'd lost his family ranch after being buried in compliance violations. A couple who had been forced to sell at a loss when the HOA claimed an easement through their backyard. A widow who'd paid tens of thousands in retroactive fees just to avoid litigation. The reporter interviewed them all, and the follow-up piece painted a clear picture of systemic abuse. The headline read, "A pattern of predation, how one HOA has seized multiple properties through legal manipulation." The response was swift and loud. A community group formed overnight calling itself Support Becket Thorne, and within 2 days, it had over 2,000 members. Local news stations requested interviews. I did 3 in one afternoon, sitting on the porch of the lodge, explaining calmly and factually what had happened. No emotion, no theatrics, just the timeline and the evidence. A state representative issued a statement saying she was launching an inquiry into HOA oversight and potential abuse of power. The momentum was building, and for the first time it felt like the pressure was shifting away from me and onto them. The HOA president tried to push back. She held a press conference outside the HOA office, flanked by 2 lawyers reading from a prepared statement. Mr. Thorne is a confused individual who refuses to accept the clear documentation of our association's legal standing. Our records are sound, and we are confident the court will uphold them. But when a reporter asked why the survey had been done by an unlicensed professional, she hesitated. No comment. This matter is in active litigation. Another reporter pressed her on the financial ties to the resort company. She refused to answer and ended the conference abruptly, walking back inside while cameras followed. The footage aired that evening, and the optics were damaging. She looked defensive, evasive, guilty. Meanwhile, my lawyer and I prepared for the hearing. We met at her office 3 times that week, going over testimony strategy, organizing exhibits, rehearsing questions and answers. Judge Dunn is fair but no nonsense, she said. Stick to the facts. Show the documents. Don't get emotional, even if they provoke you. We practiced with Boone playing the role of opposing counsel, throwing aggressive questions at me, while I kept my answers short and grounded. It helped. By the end of the week, I could recite the key points without hesitation. The survey was fake. The service was improper. The financial motive was clear. The night before the hearing, I sat alone in the lodge. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the documents were stacked neatly on the table, ready to go. I walked through the house one more time, touching the walls, the bims, and the stone around the fireplace. Every surface was a memory. Every corner held a piece of the 7 years I'd spent here. I thought about the tent I'd lived in during that first winter, the frost on the canvas, the ache in my hands from swinging a hammer in the cold. I thought about the day I'd hung the last door and stood back to see the finished structure for the first time. And I thought about Claire, about the promise I'd made to build this place, and the promise I was making now to keep it. I picked up her photo from the mantel and sat down by the fire. Tomorrow we will find out if any of this mattered, I said quietly. If the work, the time, the fight, if it counts for anything. The flames reflected in the glass of the frame, and for a moment I could almost see her smiling back at me, the way she used to when I was overthinking something. She'd have told me to stop worrying and trust the process, to believe that the truth would hold up under scrutiny. I set the photo back on the mantel and checked my bag one last time. Deed, survey, permits, timeline, everything I needed to prove that this land was mine. The eviction notice sat on top 14 days, expired, the threat hanging over everything. But tomorrow, I'll get my chance to fight back. And I wasn't going to waste it. The courtroom was packed. I arrived early, but the gallery was already filling with people I recognized, and plenty I didn't. Supporters from the community group, journalists with cameras, curious locals who had followed the story. I took my seat at the table next to my lawyer, and across the aisle, the HOA president sat with her legal team, 3 attorneys in expensive suits. Briefcases, open papers spread out like a defensive wall. She didn't look at me, just stared straight ahead, jaw set, posture rigid. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Dunn entered. He was older, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had seen too many bad arguments to tolerate another one. He sat, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at the files in front of him. This is a hearing on the motion to vacate default judgment and emergency injunction. Let's proceed. My lawyer stood and began. Her voice was calm, clear, and methodical. Your Honor, the plaintiff failed to provide actual notice as required by state law. Mr. Thorne never received notification of the original hearing and the HOA's proof of service is insufficient for a property seizure of this magnitude. She walked the judge through the exhibits. My sworn affidavit, photos of my mailbox undamaged and checked daily, testimony from a neighbor who confirmed no process server had been seen on the property. The HOA's proof of service consisted of a single certificate of mailing with no tracking number, no signature, and no confirmation of delivery. Under Washington case law specifically, Jones versus Flowers, meaningful notice is required. A certificate of mailing does not meet that standard when the property itself is at stake. The opposing counsel objected, arguing that mail service was sufficient under the rules. My lawyer responded without hesitation. Not for property seizure, Your Honor. The statute is explicit, and the case law is clear. Judge Dunn reviewed the documents in silence, flipping pages, making notes. Then he nodded. Continue. My lawyer placed additional exhibits on the table, postal records showing no certified mail attempt at my address during the claimed delivery window, and an affidavit from the local postal carrier who'd serviced my route for 12 years, stating he had no recollection of any legal documents requiring signature. The opposing counsel shifted in his seat but said nothing. The second phase focused on the survey. My lawyer called an expert witness, a licensed surveyor with 30 years of experience. He took the stand and walked the court through his analysis. I reviewed both surveys. The HOA's survey from 2020 has multiple issues. The property lines don't align with county GIS records. The measurements are inconsistent with the actual topography. And most critically, the surveyor listed on the document had his license suspended in 2019. He pulled up a side-by-side comparison on a projector, showing the discrepancies in vivid detail. Then he presented his own survey, completed the week before, which matched my original boundaries exactly. There's no ambiguity here. The HOA's map is fabricated. The opposing counsel tried to challenge him on cross-examination. How can you be certain the original survey is correct? The expert didn't flinch. Because I physically resurveyed the property using GPS and county markers. The results are consistent with every historical record except the HOA's version. He handed over the data logs and reference coordinates. The lawyer had no follow-up. My lawyer then introduced the digital forensics report, projecting the metadata analysis on the screen. Your Honor, this document was created in 2020, but it was modified extensively in 2024, just weeks before Mr. Thorne was first contacted. The modifications were made in image editing software, not professional surveying tools. The file history is clear. Someone manually redrew these boundaries to support a false claim. Then my lawyer introduced the old survey from '95, the one Boone had kept all these years. Your Honor, this document shows that for 30 years, the boundaries have remained consistent until the HOA needed to claim this land. She placed both maps on the evidence table. Judge Dunn leaned forward, studying them. Then he looked at the HOA president, who authorized the survey in question. She was forced to take the stand. Her lawyer objected, but the judge overruled. She sat down, composed but tense. Our surveyor came recommended through industry contacts, she said. My lawyer stepped forward. Recommended by whom? A pause. I don't recall the specific referral. My lawyer let the silence hang for a moment, then moved on. And were you aware that this surveyor's license had been suspended for fraudulent work? The HOA president's jaw tightened. I relied on staff to verify credentials. My lawyer didn't pause. So, you're saying you didn't personally verify the qualifications of someone whose work would be used to seize private property? No answer, just a thin-lipped stare. The financial motive came next. My lawyer presented the loan documents, the ownership records showing the HOA president's stake in the resort development company, and the leaked email listing my property as a priority acquisition. Your Honor, this isn't about governance or community standards. This is real estate fraud for private profit. The opposing counsel objected. My client's business ventures are irrelevant to the HOA's jurisdiction. Judge Dunn didn't hesitate. Overruled. Motive is highly relevant to a fraud claim. Then my lawyer called the HOA secretary, who'd been granted immunity in exchange for testimony. She was nervous, hands folded tightly in her lap, but her words were clear. I was instructed to backdate meeting minutes to make it appear the property acquisition had been voted on. I was told no one would check. She glanced at the HOA president, and I was told if I refused, I'd be replaced. She used the same tone she used in court when she was a prosecutor, like refusing wasn't an option. The gallery murmured at that. Judge Dunn rapped his gavel once and the room went silent again. The secretary continued. There were other properties too, a list she kept in a locked drawer, all prime locations, all targeted the same way, find a technicality, apply pressure force, a sale or seizure. Mr. Thorne's land was just the most valuable. My lawyer thanked her and turned back to the judge. Your Honor, this is a pattern, not an isolated mistake, a deliberate, systematic effort to defraud property owners for financial gain. The HOA president's lawyer tried to salvage the situation by putting her on the stand to defend herself, but she stumbled. Her answers were vague, contradictory. She couldn't explain the survey inconsistencies. She couldn't justify the fabricated meeting minutes. And when my lawyer asked directly if she stood to profit from acquiring my land, she deflected. I built this community. I have a right to protect its standards. My lawyer's response was sharp. You falsified documents, targeted multiple property owners, and used your position for financial gain. That's not protection, that's fraud. The courtroom was silent. The HOA president's face flushed red, but she had no answer. Judge Dunn called a 10-minute recess. When he returned, the room went still. He sat, opened his folder, and began. I've reviewed the evidence presented today. This court finds the following. First, the default judgment is vacated. The plaintiff failed to provide proper notice, and the defendant's right to due process was violated. Second, the emergency injunction is granted. All eviction proceedings are halted immediately. Third, the HOA's property claim is dismissed with prejudice. The survey submitted is fraudulent, and the financial conflict of interest raises serious questions about intent. He paused, looking directly at the HOA president. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the county prosecutor for investigation into potential criminal fraud. He turned to me. Mr. Thorne, your property rights are affirmed. The lodge is yours. The gavel came down and the sound echoed through the courtroom like a bell. People in the gallery stood and applauded. Judge Dunn let it go for a few seconds before raising his hand for silence. I sat there, hands flat on the table, feeling the weight of 2 months lift off my shoulders. My lawyer leaned over and whispered, "It's over. You won." I nodded, but I couldn't speak yet. Across the aisle, the HOA president gathered her papers with shaking hands, while her lawyers packed their briefcases in silence. She didn't look at me as she left, flanked by her legal team, camera flashes lighting up the hallway outside. I stayed seated until the room mostly cleared, just breathing, letting the reality sink in. The lodge was mine. It had always been mine, but now it is official, undeniable, protected. The weeks after the hearing blurred together. News spread, interviews aired, and for a while I barely slept. A month passed before the county prosecutor filed criminal charges, fraud, forgery, theft by deception, abuse of process. The HOA president now faced 5 to 10 years if convicted, her license already suspended pending investigation. The news hit the local papers, and this time the headlines weren't about me. They were about her, about the system she'd manipulated and the people she'd hurt. I didn't take pleasure in it, but I didn't look away either. Justice wasn't just about winning, it was about accountability. The civil side moved just as quickly. My lawyer filed a damages claim, legal fees, emotional distress, and the cloud she'd put over my property title. The HOA's insurance carrier settled within a month, $250,000, plus a public apology published in the same paper that had run the original expose. The apology was brief and lawyered to death, but it was there in black and white. An admission that the claim had been without merit and that I had been wronged. I put half the settlement into a fund for other victims. The other half went toward paying my lawyer and shoring up my savings, which had been drained by months of fighting. Other victims came forward once the criminal charges were public. The older man who'd lost his ranch, the couple with the easement dispute, the widow who'd paid tens of thousands in bogus fees. They filed a class action lawsuit, and my lawyer took the case pro bono. The HOA members, the regular people who had joined thinking they were supporting their community, called an emergency meeting and voted to dissolve the organization. The assets were liquidated, and the proceeds were divided among those who'd been defrauded. It wasn't enough to undo the damage, but it was something. And it sent a message that this kind of abuse wouldn't be tolerated quietly anymore. The fallout reached the state legislature. A representative I'd never met introduced a bill called the HOA Transparency and Accountability Act. It required all boundary claims to be verified by a state-licensed surveyor with no financial ties to the HOA. It mandated disclosure of any conflicts of interest involving board members and development deals. And it gave victims of fraudulent claims the right to seek triple damages. The bill passed with bipartisan support, and in the signing ceremony, the representative mentioned my case by name. People started calling it the Thorn Act, though that wasn't the official title. I didn't care what they called it. I just cared that it might stop someone else from going through what I had. Locally, things shifted too. A legal aid group established a property rights defense fund, offering free consultations to homeowners facing dubious claims. I donated $50,000 from my settlement, and others contributed as well. Within 6 months, the fund had helped a dozen families fight back against overreach, and not one of them had lost their home. My lawyer opened a second practice focused entirely on pro bono work for property disputes. She said my case had reminded her why she went to law school in the first place. I told her she'd saved more than my lodge. She'd saved my belief that the system could work if you fought hard enough and had the evidence to back it up. But the legal victories and policy changes didn't erase what the fight had cost. I'd spent 2 months barely sleeping, buried in paperwork and legal strategy. I'd watched my savings dwindle and my reputation get dragged through the mud by people who didn't know me. I'd felt the isolation of being labeled a troublemaker, the sting of neighbors crossing the street to avoid me. Even now, with the judgment vacated and the charges filed, some of that lingered. There were people in town who still believed I'd been the problem, who hadn't followed the case closely enough to see how it ended. I couldn't change their minds, and I'd stopped trying. The truth was on record, and that had to be enough. I did rebuild some of those relationships, though. The older woman who had confronted me in the parking lot sent a handwritten note a month after the hearing. She apologized, said she'd been misled by the posts online, and hadn't taken the time to hear my side. She didn't ask for forgiveness, just offered it if I ever needed a casserole or someone to talk to. I wrote back and told her I appreciated it. Boone, who'd never wavered, kept stopping by with beer and bad jokes. And a few neighbors I'd never met before started waving when they passed my driveway, some of them even pulling over to say they were glad I'd stood my ground. Slowly, the community I'd thought I'd lost started to come back, quieter and smaller than before, but real. 6 months after the verdict, I decided to mark the moment. Not with a celebration exactly, but with something permanent. I called Boone and asked if he'd help me build a sign. He showed up the next morning with a slab of cedar and his tools, and we spent the day in his workshop cutting and sanding and carving. The sign was simple. Freedom Lodge, built by hand, defended by law. Established 2018. Liberated 2025. In memory of Claire Thorne, who taught me to never quit. We mounted it on 2 posts at the top of the driveway, and when it was done, Boone stepped back and nodded. "That'll stand," he said. I believed him. We held a small gathering the day we installed it. My lawyer came along with the reporter who had broken the story, a handful of neighbors, a couple of people from the Property Rights Defense Fund. Boone brought his wife, and someone else brought a cooler of drinks. It wasn't a party, more like a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted. I stood in front of the sign and said a few words, keeping it short. This house was always about freedom, freedom to build, freedom to live without someone telling me what I could or couldn't do. But now it stands for something more. It stands for the idea that you can fight back when the system is rigged against you, that you can win if you have the truth and the patience to prove it. And that freedom isn't something you're given. It's something you protect every single day. People nodded, and a few clapped, and then we all stood around talking while the sun dropped toward the ridge. The lodge glowed in the late light, solid and permanent, exactly the way Claire and I had imagined it. I thought about the 7 years it took to build and the 2 months it took to defend. I thought about the people who'd tried to take it and the people who'd helped me keep it, and I realized that the house wasn't just mine anymore. It was a symbol, a reminder that ordinary people could stand up to power and corruption and still come out on the other side. After everyone left, I walked out onto the balcony and stood where I'd stood that first morning, back when the only threat was the wind and the cold. The valley stretched out below, green and quiet, untouched by the noise of the past months. I held a cup of coffee and watched the light fade, the stars beginning to show through the gaps in the clouds. 7 years to build, 2 months to defend, a lifetime to protect. The house wasn't just wood and stone anymore. It was proof that the work mattered, that the promises we make to the people we love are worth keeping no matter the cost. I looked back through the window at the photo of Claire on the mantel, her face lit by the glow of the fire inside. "We did it," I said quietly. "The house stands, and it's going to keep standing." The wind picked up, moving through the pines, and for the first time in months I felt the weight lift. Not completely, but enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to believe that the worst was behind me, and enough to know that whatever came next I'd be ready, because I'd learned something in the fight. I'd learned that freedom isn't just about being left alone. It's about having the courage to defend what you've built, brick by brick, word by word, until the truth is undeniable. And that's what I'd done. That's what this place would always represent. The camera of my mind pulled back and I saw the lodge glowing in the dark valley, a single point of light against the mountains, a beacon, a promise kept, and a reminder that some battles are worth fighting, no matter how long they take. Leave a comment, hit like, subscribe, and if you'd like to help the channel grow, that little thanks button down below means a lot.